My wife and I started doing genealogy in about 1979. Anybody remember the show Centennial? It was a really interesting mini series. And there was one on roofs that was on African American people, and this one.
People there long enough that they want to see you too. So.
Okay.
I didn't know if you needed your computer or what. But I know it's hard to know where you have to always go.
Okay, well, let me stand right here. Anyway, we got interested in doing genealogy when that came out. It was a 25-hour miniseries that talked about it was a I can't remember which slide they were, but you start out with a young boy and his grandfather, and it went through their family history for decades. Anyway, it was really interesting, and I always wondered, okay, what did my family do? I knew we were Shawnee, but that's all I knew. So my wife and I started traveling around. We lived in Tulsa now, but we lived in the middle part of Oklahoma. We started traveling all over the country. Came up here about 1979 and went to the library. And at that time, there were a lot of historians like John that did a lot of research on the mission and in this area, and I became really good friends with them. They gave us a lot of information. But then we moved off for 20 years down in Texas working, and since I've been back, as soon as I got back, we came back up here and kind of started a relationship again. And then with all the hullabaloo that's been going on, I wanted to get more involved. And my family was here, and this is almost 200 years ago now, that they went to school here, they lived here. I'm going to explain all that. So it's personal to me, and I was asked by somebody with the board why I would drive all the way from Tulsa to be on this board, and I said, well, my family lives here, and it's important to me. I didn't want to see our chief get a hold of this. It wouldn't be a good thing for society. And so that's why I'm here. And I always enjoy talking about this if I get the chance. So hopefully next year I'm going to talk about the Shoshos, who were another part of my family, and they did all the fur trading up here. And there's a book that one of our board members wrote. Well, there he is. If I can't get him to do it, they're going to make me do it. But the Shosho story is fantastic too. And so hopefully we'll get that done next year. Anyway, I'm going to move back over here so I can see my laptop. I don't want to work on this. But let me warn you, don't try to read what I have on my slides. I have that for me, and if I were to give this to someone, they can read it. But let's just listen. I'm going to explain it. But no, if you read it, you're going to forget what I'm saying. And you won't be able to read it from back there. So just, it's just the way I do training, so I can't help it the way I do that. Anyway. So in order to tell what the story of the Shawnee here, you have to tell where they came from. Why were they here? They weren't like the Kaw that this was their land. They were on the East Coast. And so the Shawnee were one of the things they call them is the greatest travelers. They moved all over the East Coast, from Florida up to Pennsylvania, New York. They were all over that area. They moved into Ohio. Chief Blackfoot said that he remembers bathing in the Atlantic when he was little. He was born in 1730 or something like that. Yeah, about 1730. He remembers bathing in the Atlantic. So they were down there. A lot of the words that are native sounding words from back east, Savannah is kind of more on Shawnee. There's a lot of Mississippi is a Shawnee word, means big river. Shawnee was one of the most recognized and most used languages back in those days. So they lived in I'm going to stand back over here. Let me see if I can move this over. Maybe you guys can see. But I got to work on this. So they said that they were part of the Fort Ancient culture, which is some mounds that are in Ohio that go back to because they kept, as you all know, they came on shore and then just kept coming. And so the Shawnee and all the other tribes were fighting them, and there were wars that went on, and there was peacetime in the wars. It kind of went like this, and every time there was peace for a few years, there'd be another war. And so I'm going to kind of talk about some of those in particular. After some of the, well, after 150 years, the tribe finally kind of splintered in late late 1700s, after the Northwest Indian Wars and before the War of 1812. Some of them moved down into Missouri, and they then became a place called Apple Creek near Cape Girardeau, and they became one of the other tribes. There's 3 tribes currently. My family left Ohio and came here, but I also had family that went from Ohio to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and so now there's still 3 different tribes. So this is kind of a map showing the areas where they lived. The larger dots are where they were higher concentrated. So they were in Pennsylvania and Ohio. That was where most of their history in the 1700s was. And then in 1829 or so, they moved to Kansas, and then 1867 they moved to Oklahoma. So you can see they were down. There were pockets of them down there, but they were never really a cohesive tribe. They were just splintered up, but they were at times, as you can see up there. But this is basically 1000 AD through today. And so the biggest history of them is the wars that they were involved in. Like all the other tribes, they fought the expansion from 1650 to the 1800s. There were conflicts that happened all the time, and in almost every case, the tribes were finding themselves pushed further and further west, and they would lose land, they would lose families. There were a lot of them killed. Whenever the different armies would come in, they would burn all their crops, burn all their houses, so they would be devastated, and they'd build themselves back up. And this is a painting of a battle called Fort Recovery in Ohio. My wife and I went there last fall. Really an interesting place. It's a national park or state park, I think. But really interesting history. I'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm going to talk about a few of the battles. I'm going to pick a couple because my Anglo family was involved in it, in this one in particular. So this Battle of Monongahela was 1755. General Edward Braddock and George Washington. George Washington was a British soldier. I don't know if he was captain. I can't remember. But they were fighting the French, and they were in Virginia, and they wanted to get rid of the French at Fort Pitt, which is Pittsburgh. It was called Fort Duquesne at the time, and there was a mouth of the Ohio. It's a big crossroads of rivers in that area. And so Braddock and George Washington, they built roads, 120 miles of roads through forest to get from Virginia up to Fort Pitt. And oddly enough, Washington had gone up there before and attacked a group of French soldiers, and he wasn't supposed to. They were actually a peace emissary, and somebody talked him into going and wiping them out, and well, that made the French mad. So this is what happened. The French came down, met them south of Fort Pitt, and they had several hundred warriors and some soldiers, and they devastated Braddock and his troops. The British troops were the first ones to come over from England to fight in a group on the American soil, was the colonies or whatever. So the British used to stand and shoot at each other, kind of like the Scots used to just run at each other with swords and whatnot. And so they didn't understand guerrilla fighting like the Indians did. And so the the Shawnee and all the rest, they were hiding behind trees. And in this book I read about it, actually this one, uh, he says that they didn't understand, the British didn't understand shooting at somebody. They just shot at a group of people. Well, the natives were shooting at somebody. And so this Captain Edmund Paulson was supposed to be one of my great grandfathers. I haven't found the connection, but my third great grandfather, his mother was named Paulson, and they lived in a little remote area of Virginia, which this guy was from as well. I just haven't found the documentation, so I think I don't know that he's a grandfather, but I think he's cousin or something. But we have something written by somebody from 100 years ago that said he was a grandfather, but you know how those stories go. But anyway, but I wanted to bring him up. He was actually the chief civil engineer on building the roads, and he was at the front of the lines when the attack started, and he corralled some of his men, and he said something about shooting. This was a British soldier. He said, "Shoot at them, don't just shoot in the in the direction." Well, then he got shot by one of their soldiers. They said the next call they killed him. It was friendly fire kind of thing. So these aren't real pictures, but these represent my actual ancestors. So this doesn't work, but this one here, Silver Heels, was my fourth great grandfather. His Shawnee name was Mwaknani. I haven't said that in a while. And he was these are siblings. Cornstalk was a peace chief of the Makochi division. He was their big chief most of the time during these wars until he was killed. And Nana Lema was their sister, and they called her Grenadier Squaw. She was 6.5 feet tall. The three of them were 6.5 feet tall. They were very large people, and they called her Grenadier Squaw because she looked like a grenadier soldier who had a real tall hat. And she fought with them, from what I understand. There's a book about her that's quite interesting. She was a chief. She had her own village in Ohio. She was an interpreter. She became Christian by the Moravians and was a peacemaker. And so Cornstalk was also really wanted peace. He didn't want war, but there were times when they had no choice. So Silver Heels, he was kind of a warrior, and he was younger brother to Cornstalk, so he was basically his aide. So that's my fourth great uncle, my fourth great aunt, and my fourth great grandpa. So this is some records of goods sold at Fort Pitt in 1756 by my family. So the ones in red, Cornstalk sold one buck and one doe skin. His mother and sister sold 9 buckskins, and then at the top, Silverheels, who was pretty busy, sold 13 buckskins and 1 doe, or 5 doe, and it's over here on how much they get. So the British wrote all this stuff down. It was like maybe they had taxes to pay on it or something. And so this, to find this, these are some of the records that you just happen to run across. So I'm really lucky that my family was kind of famous, and I know other tribal members, they don't have a clue who their family members were. They know a name up to a point, usually a Christian name, and then beyond that, it's an Indian name that they don't have. There's no records of them typically. So I've been really fortunate that way. And then Blue Jacket's on here. He was a very well-known chief. His brother, I didn't know he had brothers, but it says his several of his brothers are on there, which I didn't know they were around. But anyway, this was just some records that existed. It was kind of cool. So the French and Indian War, you guys heard that, 7-year war they call it. The Battle of Monongahela basically started that war. And so the Shawnee fought with the French during it. And during that time, the Shawnee and the other tribes raided the homesteads in Virginia and the forts in Virginia. They were being encroached upon, and they didn't want these people there. anybody saw Last of the Mohicans, there's a scene in there where they go through a homestead and all the people are killed, and one of the ladies wants to bury them, and he said, no, we have to leave them the way they are. And anyway, that was typical. And so the frontiersmen of Virginia and that area, they would go attack the tribal towns and stuff. So it was tit for tat. And this time, the Shawnee were the most feared tribes of the eastern during this time. So my point is the Shawnee were not particularly nice. I mean, they were trying to stay their homelands. If you can't understand that, then I don't know what to tell you. But anyway, they were pretty ruthless. There's a story that Cornstalk went to a family and they were friendly at the time. They had dinner and all that, and then he gave a signal and they killed everybody. And so it doesn't surprise me. But the same thing happened to a Mingo chief. The frontiersmen did the same thing to them. They got them all drunk and killed them all. And so that's coming up in a minute. But so there was lots of bad stuff going on. Yes.
But wasn't Cornstalk murdered under a white flag of his cousin and
Oh yeah,
another
yeah,
cousin
yeah.
too?
Yeah, that's
So
another.
the other side wasn't good either.
Yeah, it's tit for tat, like I said. Yeah. So this is another raid during the French and Indian War on a place called Fort Upper Tract. It was on the Potomac, it's what's now West Virginia, and there were Delaware and Shawnee warriors, and they killed 22 settlers that were in this fort. They weren't supposed to be there. My fifth great grandfather, who was a Scottish immigrant on my lee side, was there, and he was killed. And so fortunately, he had his daughter who married my lee side. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. If you think about some of these things that happen, any one thing that changes, you're not here. And I can actually document them. So anyway, the next day, the warriors moved on to another place called Fort Sabre, and they killed or captured 40 soldiers. And at first one, they didn't know who did it until they went to Fort Sabre, and then they said, "Oh yeah, they had come up from Fort Upper Track." So I'm trying to connect. Both sides of my family were involved in this. So in this case, I suspect Silver Heels and Cornstalk raided Fort Upper Track and killed my fifth great grandfather on my European side. So Silver Heels, this is a story that my wife and I ran across this from a cousin in about 1979, 1980, and we never got a copy of this magazine. It's a stories magazine about him, and she found it on eBay about a couple of years ago. We've been looking for it for 40 years, and it's a really great story. But what it talks about, so I was telling you about Chief Logan. His family were killed by frontiersmen. They went to his site. They were across the river, and they said there was some peace going on at that time, and so they were, hey, come on over. And well, they got them all drunk, and they did a turkey shoot kind of thing. And they said after the Indians all shot their guns, they killed them all, so they couldn't fight them back. And so Chief Logan wasn't there. He was actually Shawnee, but he was living with the Mingo. They all kind of moved around, and so he went on a killing spree, and he went out to trying to go down to Chillicothe, Ohio, and he was going to kill these traders. He knew these traders were down there, and as a revenge. Well, Cornstalk didn't want that to happen. He'd heard about this, and he sympathized with Logan, but he didn't want these people killed because they were there on a trading mission. They brought them there, and it wasn't fair. So he asked Silver Heels to escort him back to Pittsburgh, and it was 250 miles or something like that. I can't remember exactly. Pretty good long distance. So he took him and a couple people took them back to Fort Pitt, and when they got to Fort Pitt, the commander of Fort Pitt didn't like native people, so he wanted to kill them. And the traders that were with them Alexander McKee and some others, they said, no, they helped us. And so he said, okay, he won't. Well, he sent them, after the Silver Heels started back home, he sent 50 men to go meet him on the river and kill him. And so they ambushed him, and Silver Heels got shot in the lung and thought it was going to be fatal. And the men went back to Fort Pitt thinking there was going to be some other warriors around, so they kind of skedaddled. And his men carried him down to one of the Moravian towns that I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But anyway, so there was a missionary, John Heckweller, that wasn't a medicine man or anything, so he said, okay, this guy's going to die. He knew him, and he said, I can't help him. So the warriors took him on down to Wakatamika, about 130 miles by stretcher, and then through the river. And he said, Silver Heel said, if I can get to Wakatamika, then I can get help by one of my men. And so he lived, he was able to recover, and they didn't think that he would. And John Heckweller saw him several years later, and they're like stunned that he was still alive. And so anyway, it's a really interesting story. And one, how else do you find something like that on a grandfather, great grandfather that's obscure like that? So some of the other Shawnee leaders, again, there's Cornstalk. Blue Jacket was his children were here. Chief Reverend Charles Blue Jacket was one of the kind of the board members here, and a lot of his children went here. He and I are related somehow. I'm related to the Blue Jackets. And then Blackfoot, or Costa was he's the one that was born in 1723. He lived till 1831. He was 100 and plus years old. He fought at Monongahela, and he didn't die until 1830. He was really instrumental in getting the Shawnee to move from Ohio here. They were being encroached on again in Ohio to the point where they just needed to move. But all three of these were really great chiefs. Blue Jacket and Miami Chief Little Turtle fought the American Army right after the Revolutionary War in a battle that is the worst defeat ever by an American army to this day. They killed the Shawnee and Miami killed 90% of the soldiers from the American army. It was just terrible for them. Right. And that kind of boosted the Shawnee and the Miamis thinking, okay, maybe we can get rid of these people, and that didn't happen. But that one's a fantastic story as well. So later, and we just kind of keep moving forward. There was Lord Dunmore's War in 1774. Last year was the 250th anniversary of it, and again, colonist expansion across the Appalachian into Kentucky and Ohio. There was all these raids. I mean, this just kept going. It's like Groundhog Day. It just kept going on and on and on. So in 1774, Cornstalk led Mingo warriors, about 1,000 Shawnee and Mingo, and they attacked what is now Point Pleasant, West Virginia. This was before the American Revolution. As a matter of fact, they call this battle really the first battle of the American Revolution. Anyway, they attacked the army there, and Lord Dunmore, who was the Virginia governor, he wasn't there at the time, but this was his group. Anyway, they had a long, drawn-out attack on both sides, and eventually, at the end of the day, the Shawnee decided to retreat back across the river. They had seen some other soldiers coming out, thinking it was reinforcements, but it wasn't. It was just a flanking thing. So they thought they were going to be overwhelmed, so they went back home. And at that point, when they got back home, Cornstalk, who didn't want to go fight down there, asked his warriors, he said, okay, we just got our tails beat. Do you want to continue to do this, or you want me to make peace? He said, if you want to continue to fight, we might as well kill all of our women and children and go fight to the death, because we're outnumbered. And they all just kind of hung their heads, I guess. And he said, okay, I'll make peace. So they talked to Lord Dunmore, and they Charlotte, and which was just a week or two later. And what they did was they said, okay, the Shawnee has no claim to Kentucky any longer. That was the boundary. They had all of Kentucky and all that, and so now the Ohio River was going to be the boundary. And part of the treaty was they couldn't kill people going up and down the river, which they like to do. If they're going up and down the river, going somewhere, well, they kill them. And well, they can't do that now. And so that was part of the treaty. Well, this didn't last long. And so in '77, there was more stuff going on. They just, you can't tell me what to do. So in 1777, Cornstalk went down to what was Fort Randolph, where they had this battle. It was now a fort. And he tried to tell the Americans that his warriors wanted to fight. They wanted to fight the Americans, and the British were encouraging them. So they were either with the British or they were with the French. They were helping give them guns and stuff. And so he was trying to keep peace. He wanted to keep the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, keep to those terms. And so he went down there and warned them, and they took him hostage. They didn't. The man that ran Fort Arbuckle, he understood that, but just everybody was kind of bad deal. So he took him and his traveling partner hostage, and his son, Cornstalk's son, went there a few weeks later and wondered why he wasn't home, and found out what was going on. Well, just after Elenichico got there, they found somebody got shot outside the fort, and they thought that Elenichico had brought in some warriors and they killed the man. And he said he didn't, but so anyway, there were these militia, and they stormed into where they were holding Cornstalk and his son and Red Horse, and just shot him. And so he was murdered there. And this is at Tuemewee Park, which is where the site of that battle was, and Fort Randolph was, and Cornstalk's buried there. And it's a pretty nice place. The big rivers, the Ohio River and the Kanawha River, come together. It's real pretty. So we go on a little bit further. Battle of Chillicothe. So after Cornstalk's murder, Shawnee went on raiding frontier, and Colonel John Bowman was a cousin of mine, my first cousin. He was the first cousin to my fifth great grandfather Cornelius Bowman. He was under George Rogers Clark, and he took it upon himself. He didn't have approval to go do it, but he attacked the town of Chillicothe up in Ohio, and he kind of burned it up. He didn't. The Shawnee got inside a log house, and he couldn't get them out, so he stole a bunch of horses, and he actually shot Chief Blackfish, not Blackfoot, but Blackfish, in the leg, and he died of blood poison or something a few weeks later. But so again, Bowman was my cousin. My great grandmother's name was Bowman, and that's her line. Well, not him, but Cornelius. Anyway, so again, both sides of my family are in this thing. And then a few years later, there's an attack on Ruggles Fort, which is near Lexington, Kentucky. And this British captain, this was during the Revolutionary War, so the British were trying to do some fighting in the Western theater, the frontier, this is all frontier still, to try and pull American soldiers away from the coast where most of the fighting was going on. And so he took about 1,000 Shawnee and some British soldiers, and they attacked Ruggles Fort, and then what's the other one? Martin Station. And Isaac Ruddle, who was the commander of the fort, this is the first time they'd ever taken a cannon out in the frontier, and he shot a couple of shots at the fort, and the guy, Isaac Ruddle, said, "Okay, well, we can't stand that. It's going to tear the fort down." And he made a deal with Captain Byrd that they wouldn't kill everybody. There were 400 people in there, so they said, okay, no problem. So they opened up the gates, and some of the Shawnee and some of the other natives went in there and killed some people. And now, they call it a massacre. It wasn't a massacre. They killed a few people. But they took 600 or 400 colonizers, that's a new term, colonizers, and marched them to Detroit, 600 miles to Detroit as captives, and they sold them to the British up there. Elizabeth Bowman Ruddle was Colonel John Bowman's sister and my first cousin. I mean, how odd is that? Some of the captives, there was Elizabeth Bowman Ruddle's son was named Stephen Ruddle. He was captured at about 15 years old, and he was raised by the Shawnee, or later, or through some years, and lived with Tecumseh. You heard the name Tecumseh, and he fought against the Americans alongside Tecumseh for about 15 years. And then I got another interesting little story here. So at the end of the Northwest Indian Wars of about 1794, the Battle of Fallen Timbers was the last battle of that. And there was a Treaty of Greenville signed, and it gave all of Ohio to the Americans. And they forced all of the tribes to give back any white captives to the Americans. Some of them didn't want to go back. A lot of them felt they loved living with the Indians, and they didn't want to go back. Lots of tears and stuff, but they were forced to go back. And then this is about the time that a lot of the Shawnee moved down into Missouri. They were tired of fighting. They've been doing this for a long time. They said, okay, we're leaving. And the Spanish government owned all that. It was before it was sold to the United States. And they asked the Shawnee to come down and fight the Osage. The Osage were causing them problems. And so they came down and helped fight the Osage. And they had a nice big area there. They eventually left because they were being encroached on by them too. So there's a link to Ruddle's Fort and the Shawnee Indian Mission, if you're not aware of it. And crazy. So Isaac Ruddle, his niece, her name was Sarah Ruddle. She was about 12 years old. She was captured at Ruddle Station and then adopted into the tribe. She lived with the tribe for over 15 years. And she married another captive named Thomas Davis. He was about the same age. I suppose it was after they were went back home. They married, and they had Thomas Johnson's wife, Sarah Davis Johnson. So Thomas Johnson was the man that built this mission, and the mother, ended up after the father died, moving here in the 1850s, 40s, whatever time it was, I'm not even sure, and lived with the Johnsons here. And she rekindled relationships with the Shawnee who lived here. She could speak Shawnee fluently. There were a number of people that she lived with in Detroit, or no, in Ohio, that she lived with them 15 years. And so it was a really interesting relationship. And so that's one of the deals of how it's related to Ruddle's Mill, or Ruddle's Fort. So here's Tecumseh. The War of 1812, he was young, he wanted to fight the Americans to get them out of Ohio again. They'd given up Ohio, but he was still trying to. So he was trying to put together a group of other tribes to come and have a pan-Indian alliance that would all go after the Americans. And he got some to do it. Most of the Shawnee wouldn't do it. Black Hook and Blue Jackets said, no, we're done fighting. It's over. And so he kept at it, and he was killed in the Battle of Thames in Canada, and it just didn't work out. But he's revered for being probably the most famous Shawnee. I don't know that he was quite somebody, as they all were. So at this time, after the War of 1812, the Shawnee, who had land, they were still in Ohio, they got stuck on these little bitty reservations in Ohio. on the treaty of Fort Meigs as having land in this Lewistown. And so we know that's where he was at that time. This is 1813 or something like that. And Silver Heels, the father, had been murdered earlier. But so this is where the Shawnee were until they moved to Kansas. And the funny thing is, they at this time, probably around 1800, they started farming. They weren't, most of them started farming. They weren't warring tribes anymore. Tecumseh was still out there fighting, but not my family, not most of them. Blackfoot and Blue Jacket, all of them, they started farming. And the funny thing was they had such nice farms that the white people wanted them. And so they pushed them out of this area, and they said, okay, the government said, oh yeah, let's get them out of here. And that's when Andrew Jackson did the Indian Removal Act, and they moved them across Mississippi. So when they did their deal, they gave them 1.6 million acres of Kansas, and which is pretty good. But if you've ever been in Ohio or in that area, well, it's pretty. It's not what they're used to, And as a matter of fact, some of the old stories by people that had come here, some of the people that frontiersmen that had come in, they said, let's move all the Indians west of the Mississippi because no white man would ever want to live there. And that was what they said. No, seriously. It's written in the book. And so the Shawnee were coerced into giving up their reservations, and then the government said they would take care of them all the way down here, and they'd get them set up and all that. And so they told them they were able to sell their farms and their houses and whatnot, and they told them to get all that done and sell all your livestock. Like I said, they had nice farms, and they did that, and then we'll move you out. And so they did that in the spring, and the government was going to move them here in early spring or early summer. And they didn't. They didn't do it till September or November or something like that. It was when they got here, it was just ice and snow, and so it almost killed them all. It was kind of like the Trail of Tears. It was a bad thing, and so some of them didn't make it, but that was the typical how the government did. Anyway, so they came here, and I have a cousin who balks at this, but he's an archaeologist, so you can't believe him anyway. But what happened, what literally happened, was a lot of these tribal leaders were friends with these missionaries. Cornstalk was a very good friend of the Moravians. I mean, he never Christianized because he said it was a conflict of interest kind of. His mother did. I'm serious. His mother did, and his sister did, not Helena, and a lot of people did. But he just said he couldn't do it. But they were like, he wanted to take a guy named Schmidt, who was one of the Moravian missionaries, and he wanted to make him an adopted son. And Schmidt said, "Oh no, that's too big an honor, And so anyway, that was the relationship with these missionaries. And so it was not like 1923. Anyway, so they asked the Shawnee Quaker Mission was established about 1834, and I believe it's south of here a little ways. And Henry Harvey was the one that was here. He was with the Shawnee in Ohio, and he wrote a book that I'll show you later. It's a really excellent book. But they established the Quaker Mission, and then the Shawnee Mission was established by Reverend Thomas Johnson, and it was actually in Turner originally, and then at some point they moved here, and the reason it was a boarding school here was because that's where the Shawnee lived. Okay, if I'm over here in Topeka, Junction City, and I got to go to school it's going to take me all day to get there. And so they decided to have, at Turner, they were teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic. And they realized, Thomas Johnson said, it's not doing them any good. When they go home, and this was a day school, when they would go home, there was nobody to speak English to, there was nothing to read, and there was no reason to decipher anything. So he said, we need to teach them a skill. So they came up with the idea of a VOTEC, and that's what this became. And they decided to have it as a boarding school because the children lived quite a place off, and it took them half a day to get here. They'd be here for a little while, and they'd have to go home. And so they did the boarding school thing, and they taught them trades. It was literally like a road tech school of today. And no matter what you say, that's what it was. And then the Shawnee Baptist Mission was, I think, a little north of here. And Isaac McCoy was their missionary, and then Johnson Meeker was also involved in that. And he wrote the first printed newspaper in Kansas. In first printed newspaper in Kansas, and it was the first newspaper ever printed in a native language, completely in a native language. The Cherokee printed newspapers, but it was in English and Cherokee. So there's only one that exists today, and they did it every week for a number of years, and it's in University of Missouri, Kansas City, and I got a copy of that. There may be one around here. I can't remember a copy of it, but anyway, it's kind of the bad. I took 3 years of Shawnee language, and I couldn't read a single word in it. It was written. Of course, there was no written language. It was just phonetic, and one of the fluent speaker said he'd read it, he couldn't read the thing. And he said what he found out was there was something in the phonetics that they changed. And he said once he figured that out, then he could read it. He translated it. It was all scripture stuff. So the Shawnee Methodist Mission, and kind of what we're talking about, was a manual labor school. And they taught crafts and trades. A lot of the accounts that we hear and you read are very positive about the mission, about how the students were treated and all that. There was one series of letters or whatever that was really bad mouthing the mission in the late 1850s, I think. And it was actually somebody trying to take over the mission from the Methodist Church. And so they were slamming how the conditions were. They said the poor children had to walk to the mess hall to eat lunch. Guess where that mess hall was? Right there. What is that, 100 yards? 175 yards or so. This was a 2,000-acre farm, working hard, and they worked the whole place. So I don't think that was too much, but that was some of it. And so if you're reading that and you live in New York, oh my God. Well, I walked further than that into college, So you have to take all that with a grain of salt. Somebody will take that and just pound that to death, thinking that that's the whole story. It's not. Not at all. So the mission was also the territorial capital of Kansas at one time. They had meetings and stuff in there. And it was on the Santa Fe Trail. So there's a lot of history here that doesn't have to do with the Shawnee. And my great grandmother's brother and her sister, their name was Ella. They were both students here. Her first cousin, who was a Shoto, was a student here, and she had umpteen cousins that were students here. She was a little too young. She was born in 1851, and she was probably a little too young to be here. I think she may have gone to Westport actually to school. So here's some of the chiefs that were in Kansas. Charles Blue Jacket was a Methodist minister. He was the grandson of Chief Blue Jacket. He was an interpreter, a very successful businessman. He's got his name on everything, all the paperwork around here, and his name on a lot of city streets and stuff. And Graham Rogers was also a chief at about 1860. He was an instructor on building skills, building trades, and he helped build the mission. He actually has a home on Marion and Academy that's still there. I'm going to show that to you in a minute. Also, during the Civil War, they gathered a group of Shawnee to go fight for the North. And Graham Rogers was leading one of those units. And then Joseph Parks, that's another name that may be familiar to you. He was an interpreter, and he also took a large group of Shawnee, and they were paid by the federal government did have, he was, had these visions and things, and they all believed in that. And he actually started war. You remember the term Battle of Tippecanoe and Tyler 2? Well, he started that. Tecumseh told him don't do anything when he left, and so the prophet had said, nah, we can get them guys. And so he attacked them. He told his warriors that they can't get shot. You can't get killed. I promise you. Well, we actually went there, my wife and I went there this last summer, and really beautiful place that Ohio has preserved. The site of the Tippecanoe battlefield and at Prophetstown, which is where the Shawnee lives. Beautiful area, beautiful. Anyway, so he kind of was in disfavor after the War of 1812, and he moved. He was with one of the first groups from Ohio to move here, and he lived up in Argentine or Argentine, whatever it's called, in a little place called White Feather Springs, and he's buried up there. And here's some of the other prominent leaders that were in Kansas. Blackfoot, the several Blackfoots, the Blue Jackets. Black Bob is a name that you may have heard. There's parks and stuff. He was actually the Black Bob band were the last holdouts. They didn't want their land in by having it themselves. They wanted it in common, and they were the ones still wearing buckskin and living in maybe teepees. Whereas my family and most of the rest of the Shawnee were living in houses here, and so, but he's a name that you might hear some captains. Cornhusker was a well-known one. Peter Cornstalk was my cousin. He was Chief Cornstalk's son. He was associated with the Quaker mission. Pascal Fish, George McDougal was a real interesting. I cannot figure out who this guy really is. He was a noted Shawnee chief. He was pretty funny. He said some things, and so this Henry Harvey wrote this book, and he was an interpreter. He would write down what these guys said at the meeting and stuff. And in one particular one, he said I'd have me a white woman if I could find one. Which I thought, well, that's really funny. And then another time, they said they were talking about the way they lived, and he said, "Do any of you want to go back to hunting and gathering for your food? We kind of like it this way." And so they had. People don't like the term assimilation. They had assimilated. They were farmers. They were ranchers. They were done fighting. You don't like that term? Sorry, that's the way it is, and we all grow here, right? So they didn't lose their culture completely, but they were losing it. And then Moses Clifford Hill was my great grandmother. So I'm not getting the end, but I'm still going. Anyway, in 1854, the Shawnee were forced to sell 1.4 million acres of land, and they gave the rest, everybody 200 acres, every man, woman, and child, 200 acres. And so they reduced that 1.6 million acres down to a very small area. And then the rest of it was sold or open to white settlement. The mission itself was given to the church, all the missions land, and then eventually it was given to Thomas Johnson, and then they sold it. And so, we lost our deals in this tree here. And so it's no longer Shawnee. Shawnee has land, but they willed it, or they wanted it to go to Johnson. They liked what Johnson did. Contrary to what my chief says, they liked it. So this is my great-grandmother. Her name's Julianne Elliott, and she was Silverheel's great-grandmother, I guess. Her parents died in about 1852. There was a cholera epidemic swept through here. If you read about that, it's pretty gruesome. But cholera came through here and killed a lot of people. Well, her parents were killed at that time. I'm assuming because of that. And she was raised by her uncle, and he was a very prominent leader, and one of the wealthiest by the time they moved to Oklahoma. And I think she may have gone to Westbrook. Her allotment land, I don't know if you know where Tomahawk Park is on 119th and Mission. There's a big green belt right through there, soccer fields and stuff. Right. That was her land. That was her last 40 acres. She owned 200 acres right there. And we've been trying to get that land back for years because I finally did find a patent where well, I don't know, she sold it. But the story is that my grandmother was told by the state of Kansas saying she owed taxes on Kansas land. And she said, well, I don't have money. You can do whatever you want with it. So we never have figured out whether it was that land or what. But in actuality, you can't tax Indian land. So if it was part of his, she shouldn't have lost it. So anyway, moving on. So Moses, this is the house, a replica of the house that Moses lived in on 47th County Line Road and Knox. It's kind of northeast of here, I think. This was built in the 1830s, that the original house. And this is a replica that was built by some school, trade school, somewhere in the 1930s, 1940s, and it was on display here for years. That's it right there. And that was back Rutledge owns it. And then this bell is right here. So this picture is probably in the 40s. And my wife and I have tried to find this house for, 40 years or more. We knew it existed because this thing talks about it. It says, oh, there's a house. It was built with Moses, the wood from his house. Not only was it a replica, it was built from the wood from his house. So it's really kind of a special deal. Anyway, we've been searching for that. Well, we finally found it at the the Kansas Archives and got to go see it. And Jennifer's going to try and get it back here. But they lived in teepees. They lived in houses like that. By the time they moved here, they never lived in teepees, but anyways. But that was a really cool find for us. When we came up here in the early 80s, we found this here at the mission, and it was just different stories about different things relating to the silver. This was in 1989. The Silver Hills house was still there, okay? And a guy was trying to restore it, and the city wanted it gone, and he was having trouble getting money. He had just sold it to somebody, but they hadn't got the paperwork done yet. Somebody forced it. And so arsonists burned it down, and that was the end of it. So if you look at this, you kind of see the mission is over there, and you can see I-35 and whatever that is, at 69 or whatever. And the Silver Hills were up here on, this is 47th, which is County Line Road. That's Wyandotte County. So that's where Moses and his son lived. This is where the Shoshmas lived, one of the Shoshmas. Blue Jackets home was here. The Shawnee Indian Mission, which is over here, is right here. Margaret Williams and her husband lived there. Richard Williams. You know where Pioneer Crossing Park is? Have you heard of that? Okay. It's on, I think it's on Shawnee Mission Parkway. She was Shawnee. He was a wagon master. Anyway, that just kind of gives you a little bit of a idea. So you see where the Quaker mission was down here and the Baptist mission up there. It's kind of hard to see. So this is a kind of interesting little deal that my cousin's grandmother wrote two stories about our family. One was this winter story here in Kansas City, and it was a large group of Shawnee met at the house of the Williams, this wagon master, and she was Joseph Park's niece, so she was Shawnee. And the story describes the gathering at their home in fantastic detail. And the daughter, Eliza Williams, was asking her mother, because the Silver Hills just pulled up in a really fancy sleigh. It was in the winter, and they went from their house down there on the sleigh. And she said, oh, who are those people? And she said, oh, that's the Silver Hills family. about the age of the lady that wrote this story. So she relayed it's written in first person, like, how did she know that? Well, anyway, she was told by Eliza Silverfield that story, and so it's really fantastic. And I'm going to try and get some copies made of that and maybe have them here available. I just haven't had time. Anyway, it's a really interesting story. I gave it to the Lenexa Historical Society, and they passed it around. So this is John Silverfield's house. That was my great grandmother's cousin. And this house, these two houses, the top one is John Silverfield, and the bottom is Graham Rogers that I mentioned earlier. And that's one's at 47th and Knox, and Graham Rogers is at McKay and can't remember the other. Anyway, but they're both still there. And I have family buried. So my two great grandparents that died of cholera, they're buried somewhere near that house, along with some other children and probably my Silverheels third great grandfather. He made it here, and so they're buried there. There's several articles that list this, talk about this house and that they're buried there. And then Graham Rogers' house is in a little neighborhood. This one's still on some fairly large area of land. I was always worried about this being Walmart or something. And it actually came up for sale. There was no one that lived in it for decades, and he sold it, and he sold it to a young couple from New York, who I went up there, my wife and I went up there with some cousins, and we talked to them, and they're hippies, young hippies from New York, and they're growing crops and stuff, and he said, no, we have no intention of hurting anything here. So I really relieved at that. I mean, that's really personal. Those two houses, that one and Moses House, are really personal to me. And so this is what it looked like originally. This isn't it, but it had dogwood in the middle, and that's kind of how both of them originally looked. And then over the years, they covered them. They covered the outside with siding and probably more lumber. But that was typical construction in those days. So this is Eliza Silverhill that I was talking about a minute ago. She had married David Bluejacket, and she's one of the ones that was getting out of that slave with my great grandmother. During the Quantrell's raid, she and her husband lived in Lawrence, or somewhere between here and Lawrence, and the story says that she and her family left the house because they knew Quantrell was coming, and she said, no, I'm not going to let that happen. So she went back to the house, and one of the Quantrell raiders stuck his head in the window, tried to climb through the window, and she hit him with this tomahawk, split his skull, killed him, but it broke her arm and the shaft of the tomahawk at the same time. She had a big cut for it. And so, she was pretty tough, Shawnee. She didn't want him in the house. And that tomahawk's still in the family. Somebody, one of the Blue Jackets still has that tomahawk. I don't know who. Now we're getting closer to the end. And so after the Civil War, the government decided, again, encroachment. That's the whole theme of our lives was encroachment. And so everybody was on the Missouri border just, well, not all of them, because a lot of them had moved here and took poor Black Bob's land that they couldn't fight back, and they pushed them out. And so the government said, okay, let's make a deal. And so they decided to shove the Shawnee down into Oklahoma, and they ended up with the Cherokee. The Cherokee had fought with the South, and so they were being punished. And the Delaware and the Shawnee said, here, you take them. And they got rid of their land here and opened it up for white settlement. And they went down, and so for 130, 40 years, we were known as Cherokee Shawnee, or adopted Shawnee by the Cherokee. I'm Cherokee because of that, but I'm also Shawnee. I don't have a Cherokee club, but I'm a Cherokee tribal member. And so most of them moved down to what is Miami and Bonita, Oklahoma, and then they kind of scattered from there. And then just our Shawnee tribe married Dr. Berger. First she married this Frank Shoto. He was the son of Frederick Shoto, who had a trading post off to the west here, up on the river. And when they got married, he was killed on a hunting trip in Oklahoma. Fell off a horse and somehow got killed. Dr. Bird had met Julia. He was a dental student and somewhere I think I don't know if he was attended and he was from Virginia. It might have been in Baltimore, but he came out here to fly his trade, I guess. And he met her. He was treating Moses for toothache and met her and just kind of became smitten with her and wanted to marry her, but she was engaged to Frank Shoto, and so she wouldn't do that. And so they got married, and then Dr. Bird moved down to Texas for a while, and then Frank was killed, and somebody happened to bump into Dr. Bird down in Texas and said, "Hey, did you know Julia was a widow?" And he said, "No." He came back up here, and they courted, and he ended up marrying her. He was a good man. And so this is the family they had. They had 7 children. That little one on the bottom is my grandmother. She was the youngest. Had 7 daughters and 1 son. And they lived, all the girls, or most of them, were schooled in Baltimore. He sent them back. He had a sister that lived in Baltimore. She was a dressmaker. And they went to school in Baltimore. I heard my grandmother was as well. But she went to school, some of them went to school with Will Rogers in Dunedin. He went to school called Willie Housel School in Minnesota. He went to school. He used to come over to the house, according to what they told us. And unfortunately, Julia died in 1891. Her three-year-old contracted meningitis and got this sick, and then she died. And they said that Julia just fell over her poor little girl body, just distraught, and then she never recovered. She died just a few weeks later. And they're both buried in a cemetery that my wife and I take care of down in Indian Territory. And this is my grandmother, Fitzhugh Bird Lee. Her name is Fitzhugh Lee, actually. She was born in 1889, and that's my dad on her lap. He was born 1910. And like I said, she was the youngest. And then she married my grandfather, Albert Sidney Lee Sr. He was a Texas newspaper man, and he was in the first state legislature of Oklahoma, and kind of a flim-flam man. But I had a cousin who was my dad's older than my dad, said that she knew him. She said he was the smartest man she ever met. And her husband was a cardiac surgeon, and her family she would know who was smart. So a lot of people say he wasn't that. I don't know. He was a really interesting person. Anyway, they divorced at some point in time, and she raised 3 kids. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the 5 Moons ballerinas. There were 5 Native American ballerinas about the same time in the 40s, 30s, 40s. They were all prima ballerinas across the world. It was a very unusual circumstance. The 2 on the right are my cousins. They're both Silverhill cousins. The second one from the right is Moselin Larkin, and then Yvonne Shoto is the one on the far right. And then the other 3 are 2 Osage sisters, Maria and Marjorie Tallchief, and then Rosella Hightower was Choctaw. And I talked to Yvonne's daughter last fall, and we were talking about whether or not that Moselin and Yvonne knew they were both Silverhills, and she said they didn't. She said they did. Do you remember? They didn't. Anyway, that was interesting because Moselin was actually part of the Eastern tribe, and Yvonne was in our Shawnee tribe, and it was just kind of ironic. Moselin is a 3rd cousin of mine, and Yvonne is a 4th cousin, just one generation. Were our common ancestors. And so that's the 2 of them. So pretty proud of that. So this was the book that Henry Harvey wrote. He was a very good friend of the Shawnee. As a matter of fact, Cornstalk and Sullivan said that the only people who ever treated him right were the Quakers. And so he was a Quaker minister. And his book is, I didn't have it, it's from the year 1681 to 1854 at close. It tells a lot about the history, but most of it is his own personal experience with it. It's available as a reprint out on the internet. It's really interesting. And this is one that David wrote, helped write. This is Uncle Share Papa about the Shotos. I know a lot about this area, but this just really opened my eyes to everything that was going on well before this was established. I mean, it's a fantastic book. It's letters written by the Shotos to Paul Menard, I think that was his wife's father. He owned the fur trade company. And so that was business. A lot of it was business, but a lot of it was personal. And it's just really interesting about all of that, and very, very well worth the effort. And then here's a few books that I suggest. There's one by Stephen Warren called The Worlds the Shawnee Made that's pretty good. He's an official Ben Barnes author. There aren't too many. And then Peter Cousins wrote one about Thompson the Prophet, which was just recent, very good. Colin Calloway's another approved author. He's a Brit. He went to Oxford or something. He doesn't live here. And then The Blue Jacket by John Sugden's good. There's a couple of frontier historical novels. Frontiersman by Alan Mecker's really good. It's got a lot of good history in it. It's made up. Some of it's made up, dialogue stuff. But it's great reading. It really immerses you into the period. And then Warrior Woman is about Mama Lema. And I talked to that guy and I said, how much of that's real? He said, well, the story's real, but a lot of stuff is real. He had to make up a couple of, like one guy that interfaced with her a lot was a composite of 2 or 3 people. The dialogue wasn't real, but fantastic book. It's my great aunt, and I'm reading about the things that she did. It's quite interesting. Anyway, that's it. So now you can see why I'm up here kind of doing this. That I really have a history here, and with the Shawnee, really enjoy it. Any questions? When they were trading back and forth. Yeah.
What were they using for exchange at that point in time?
They would goods, metal goods. They would give them